So in this video, I'm going to show you why most men's joint issues stem from having weak tendons compared to the strength of their muscles. And I'm going to show you how to rebuild them like Wolverine, because Wolverine's superpower was not having this massive amount of strength. It was regeneration. His tissues repaired faster than they broke down. And even though we don't have the regenerative superpowers like Wolverine, we can align with the physiological mechanisms to help us build extremely strong and dense tendons, and therefore decreasing the amount of joint issues that we have, so that we can keep on increasing our performance during our training sessions week by week, which is what we want, without pain, a lot of functionality, and thrive for the decades to come. Now, first off, if you're new to the channel, I'm Tim, and I help men who are fed up with having physical issues they develop by traditional forms of fitness, so they build an athletic, lean, and pain-free body in less than 1.5 hours a week. And we do this by using extremely precise signaling over two physical capacities that are fundamental to how we move. Now, if we want to address building strong and capable tendons and decrease joint issues, we first want to understand that pain is complex. Pain is rarely one thing. If you experience pain at the level of your joint, it's never just only having underloaded or overloaded your tendon in a situation, or connective tissue in a situation, or discrepancies, whatever. It's also the combination of potentially a state that you are in, more in a sympathetic, stressed state, or emotions that you might experience, being anxious that day, or anxious that you again experience that level of pain. So our brain has bundles of these pieces of information called neurotags, and a piece of information is being pulled, a string of information is being pulled, there's a signal that is being sent towards an area in which that pain is being sent or being felt. So a nociceptor comes to an area in which it wants to withdraw a specific type of movement. Now the problem, it's complex. And in this complexity, once that string of information is being pulled, it doesn't mean that your tissue is still in a state of healing, of regeneration that happens after a acutely or chronic or especially an acute situation. But what happens is that the pain still keeps firing. So therefore it's complex, because we often don't know precisely where it stems from. What we do know is that once we are in a state of pain, our capacity tends to be lower than the demand that is being placed or has been placed on our structure, on our body. So this is something that is always comes to the surface. Your brain and nervous system perceives your undercapacity, or you're undercapacitated to deal with a certain demand or stressor. Now, if you want to flip the script, what most men try to do is they back off. They think, oh, this is pain, I'm going to back off here. But the only way out of a situation of pain is to increase your capacity to deal with the demand or the stressor over a period of time, and therefore become more powerful and to decrease the necessity of the brain and the nervous system to send these signals of pain. Now, what I found with the capacity gaps that most men fall into are threefold. So there are three categories that I see most men fall into, in which they are in this chronic state of pain and undercapacitated to match a certain demand or stressor that is being placed on the body. And the first one is underloading. So with most men that come to me, they have either issues at the level of the shoulders, elbows, knees. They tend to be very present. But what happens is they've been working or trying to build skeletal muscle, growth of their skeletal muscle, and therefore neglect training their connective tissue, training their tendons. But tendon cells are not passive, which is what most men miss. If you don't stimulate them properly, especially in relation to skeletal muscle and force production, they go catabolic. They degenerate as much as the tendon would do in overusage. And what degeneration or catabolically means is that they break down. And therefore, what you want to avoid is, of course, that you not stimulate tendon in relation to your increase in skeletal muscle and force production, so and potentially accumulate a lot of damage by underusing your tendons. And this is something I see a lot. Partial ranges of motion training, a lot of focus on just simply force production, muscle size, and what tends to happen is that the connective tissue gets neglected. Now the second one is overloading. Also sometimes the situation, and what happens here is that there is an involvement of connective tissue, of tendons in certain movements, but the load is very high and the velocity is very high. So think of jumping, sprinting, explosive, pull-ups, dips, a lot of these jerk movements in which there's a high load on the body and there's a very quick displacement in space. And with jerk motions is often the opposite direction. So if you think of a pull-up, if you lower towards the ground and then you pull in an opposite direction very forcefully, explosively, that is a jerk. And that puts the tendons into a situation where they have to manage not tensile forces, so forces that are slow, but rapid movements, which is an additional factor because it's a multiplication of forces that are acting, in this case, on tendons that have not yet progressively been overloaded and conditioned to match the forces that are coming in. So this is a second category. And the third one I often see a lot, which is hovers over these two, is just poor recovery. Now, muscles tend to adapt faster than tendons because muscles are rich in capillaries, meaning they have a lot of blood circulation, oxygen, nutrients coming in that support recovery. Tendons have that in a lower capacity, and therefore they take a little bit longer to remodel and condition and come back stronger, which means that if you don't properly let the tendons heal and also provided the necessary components for recovery, think of sleep, think of proper nutrients that comes out of food and substrate, then what happens is that the tendons don't have the capacity to heal in the most proficient way. And if you then overstimulate it or understimulate it, especially overstimulation, they are not yet ready to deal with the demands that are then being placed on the body. So these three capacity gaps I see often with the men that I tend to help, therefore not having utilized the full power that their tendons potentially have. Now, what most men don't realize is that tendons, just like skeletal muscle, they love load. Again, according to the three categories that we mentioned, tendons, in order to adapt, get stronger, they need to be stimulated. They need to be loaded. But they love the right stimulus for the right demand. But just to give you an idea, the Achilles tendon alone can carry 6 to 8 times your body weight. And the patellar tendon 4 to 6 times your body weight. And this is because of the viscoelastic materials that comprise fascia, connective tissue, the extracellular matrix, and that has shape-shifting abilities in which it can manage forces very, very well. But again, right stimulus, right demand, they need to be properly conditioned. And that brings me towards this idea that they are just as mechanosensitive as skeletal muscle. Now, what does this mean? It means that in order for the cells that comprise tendons, tendocytes, just like with skeletal muscle, they need to be stimulated properly, which is a process called mechanotransduction. So what happens if you're not stimulating your tissues well enough, especially or as also your tendons, the signal or the tension that happens at the surface level of the cell does not attach towards the hooks that need to be attached or that need to be provided the stimulus in order to cascade a couple of events all the way to the nuclei and back, so it becomes stronger and better. So it misses the hook or it misses the proper stimulation, so it undergoes certain processes to come back. Whereas if you give it a proper stimulation, it hooks itself towards the mechanical tension, and then it cascades this process called mechanotransduction, so it produces new collagen in this case and comes back better and stronger over time. So stimulation, just with muscle growth, the same goes for tendon growth, tendon growth, it needs to be stimulated accordingly. Now, If we take into account all of the three capacity gaps categories and this mechanism, then the solution or the best form for stimulation of tendons in this case is where we give the body a high load but not at a high velocity, because it might not be conditioned enough to handle the forces that are coming in. So high load, low velocity means that we're trying to train certain movements very slow under a very high demand at a full range of motion, so that we're including both connective tissue as skeletal tissue to make sure that both are stimulated accordingly across a full range of motion. The low velocity means that the forces that are coming in are stimulating enough at a high demand. And we want to adhere to giving the tendons, in this case, an acute, very high acute stressor versus this accumulated stress, because it potentially doesn't have the right amount of time for recovery to take place. So if you look at this graph here, the optimal match for this sort of high velocity or high load, low velocity is more on the left side. So this is where we're matching in giving the tendons a proper stimulation versus this low velocity in which it can adhere towards the forces that are coming in and make sure that the adaptation keeps happening. Now, to give you an example of how we like to do this inside of the protocol, so how do we like to train the tendons as much as we can, just like with our skeletal tissue, in order to get stronger, produce more force without having joint issues, is by giving you an example. So the example I'm going to use here is a front lever. Now, the front lever row is one of the 6 patterns that has us utilize training our body at our max capacity in 6 patterns. The pattern that we're training here is for the upper body, where we're trying to pull from partial shoulder extension to full shoulder extension. Now, the idea with the protocol here is that we are now training to full range. So going from partial extension to full extension is going from mid-range to full range. What we also want to do is we want to stimulate every inch of the pattern, which bodyweight training in this case allows us to do, as much as we can. So the closer we get towards our max threshold every inch of this row, the lower the movement pattern will be executed and the higher the load will be. So we don't have to sacrifice building our skeletal muscle, force production, getting stronger, getting bigger, and functional muscles as a result. We are also adhering or making sure that the tendons at full ranges of motion and across the entire range also get stimulated by adhering to this high load, low velocity, because we stay so close towards our maximum capacity. That's the whole idea. If you think about, if I, for example, would do here a normal row with the feet on the ground at the starting point, my pulling motion is much faster. I can pull much faster, but that is because the load is lower. So in this case, I'm actually utilizing this super high load on the body, where it also has this benefit of being very low in velocity. So there's a very low movement, the speed of movement is at a very low rate, and that is what tendons really love. Now, this is one of the 6 movement patterns in the sagittal plane of motion, in which we build both tendons as much as we can, and we build a lot of force production with skeletal tissue as much as we can, apart from also having more of this end range conditioning, in which we're really triggering and stimulating the end ranges of our range of motion that for most men are most restricted, shoulder, spine, and hips. And also for building this raw strength, focusing on the shoulder, spine, especially the shoulders and the hips, have most of the benefits, because the biggest muscles are around these joints, and we possess the most amount of ranges of motion. So just to summarize, this is exactly how we're combining tendon training, skeletal muscle training at the highest regard, respecting both how both tissues are stimulated towards their best in their best fashion or most efficient fashion without risking potential injuries down the line. Training full range of motion, making sure that we're as close towards our maximum capacity every inch of a movement pattern, making the movement pattern itself very slow and providing that stimulus that it needs in order to get better and stronger. So that's what we're doing. We're respecting tendons biology, also skeletal tissue biology, so that they over time develop real capacity to handle larger and larger amounts of force. And what I've also noticed from a personal perspective and from the clients, the men that I work with, is that once you work first through high level or a lot of conditioning, slow movements, high load, the collagen or the fibers and collagen over time get so thick and dense that once you then go into high load, high velocity, sprinting, jumping, explosive pull-ups, dips, etc., they are just much more capable to absorb these forces and utilize it and propel back forwards. So you will not grow claws like Wolverine, but we do build the closest things towards Wolverine's biology that we can do by really aligning with the physiology behind it and properly stimulating tendons towards a full range and end ranges of motion in a movement pattern that is slow at a very high regard. And from a result perspective, what I've seen with the men that I've worked with is that they just keep hitting plateaus or banging through plateaus, because not only have we just a couple of movement patterns and the mobility patterns inside of the protocol that are very progressive and scalable and adhere towards high load, low velocity, we also stem away from this much or sort of high volume training. We're trying to only induce proper stimulation through a range of motion, fighting for every inch or making sure that every inch of a movement pattern is accounted for. So we don't train cycles, 1 rep, 2 rep, 3 rep. We train more percentages inside of a cycle, which makes 1 rep almost feel like an entire set on itself. And what I've seen is that multiple men, they just keep crushing it. Where I see, for example, in this case, a client who started out with a regular push-up is now doing tuck planches in just 4 weeks. I've seen a 67-year-old power lifter starting with a partial one-leg squat is now doing full one-leg squats in an elevated fashion with no more knee pain, no more hip pain holding him back. I've seen another client in the past who had chronic shoulder injuries from bench pressing, now doing full range dips, no problem, and also is exceeding his performance. I've seen a client of mine who was doing partial sissy squats, had a hip impingement and also some knee aggravation, now doing full range sissy squats with even a weight on top of him. I've seen another client who've unlocked his deep squat also by proper stimulation of end range of the end ranges of his joint. I've seen another client who had joint issues from traditional weightlifting, now doing also front lever rows, tuck rows, and has no more joint issues. So this is the result of when you properly strengthen and condition your tendons, and therefore also have an increase in your output, because the discrepancy between the force you can produce from a skeletal from a muscle perspective is in sync with connective tissue that is just conditioned over a longer period of time. Now, if you want to experience something similar like these gents, you can follow, or you can basically apply in the link below. And if not, you can check out the other materials on the channel to make sure that you keep evolving your journey along the way. Okay, this was it, and I'll see you in the next time.